Hi, everyone. Thank you, Fran and Rebecca, and thanks to the Society for having me tonight. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Tonight, I am going to be discussing a project that's taking a little bit of a fresh look at a sort of old or constant question in Southwest archaeology and ethnology, and that's the distinction between Eastern and Western Pueblos. And I'll get into what that means in a minute, but I wanted to start by acknowledging the origins of this project, which are as part of a larger project, the Cyber Southwest project. And Cyber Southwest is a database, an online database of archaeological sites and artifacts. It covers the greater Southwest, so Chihuahua and Sonora up to Colorado and Utah, and California out to Texas. There are tens of thousands of sites in the database and millions of artifacts recorded. And if you want to take a look at the database, you're welcome to at cybersouthwest.org. And this project started as a couple of us who were working on that project were thinking of ways we could use this database to revisit some issues in Southwest archaeology, and maybe we could offer something new to those discussions. And the project involved contributions from a lot of different individuals and several institutions, including the School of Anthropology and the Department of Management and Information Systems at the University of Arizona, the Department of Anthropology at CU Boulder, the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at ASU, and Archaeology Southwest. And all these individuals contributed to the project in their own ways. And so as I said, we're looking at ways we could use this database to take a new look at some of the longstanding issues in Southwest archaeology. And one of those that we wanted to look at was this distinction between Western and Eastern Pueblos. And when I talk about Western Pueblos, I mean Hopi, Zuni, the Pueblos of Arizona and Western New Mexico, and Eastern Pueblos are those in New Mexico along the Rio Grande. And ethnologists in the Southwest have discussed the differences between these Pueblos, the social distinctions or the different ways of organizing their societies since the end of the 19th century, and really in the early 20th century is when they formulated this idea of a distinction. All these groups are Pueblo groups, but these ethnologists noted that there were some important distinctions between the two. So for instance, the Western Pueblos, their primary social unit, the primary unit around which the societies are organized are clans. And this is in comparison to the Eastern Pueblos where moieties are more important, and a moiety being a division of society into equal parts. In the Western Pueblos, there's usually exogamous marriage between clans compared to endogamous marriage within moieties in the Eastern Pueblos. In the Western Pueblos, they usually practice matrilocality in comparison with the Eastern Pueblos, patrilocality, where ownership is determined through the father's line as opposed to the mother's line. In the Western Pueblos, there's also a greater emphasis on Kachina ceremonialism compared with the Eastern Pueblos, where religious societies like medicine societies and clown societies and war societies and others are much more the center of religious practice. And both of these religious practices are included in both areas or practiced in both areas, but the relative importance of each is a little bit different in each area. And this is just scratching the surface of some of the differences that were noted and kind of form the core of the difference between the two areas. I also want to discuss very briefly the concept of a Cohesion bridge. And this is a bit of a controversial topic, but it's worth mentioning. And the idea is that the Western Cohesion Pueblos of Acoma and Laguna formed a bridge, social bridge for movement of ideas and concepts between the Western and Eastern Pueblos. For instance, Kachina ceremonialism originated in the Western Pueblo region and probably spread to the Eastern Pueblos through these intermediaries in the Western Cohesion area. one of the things we wanted to do with this project is approach the issue of differences between Western and Eastern Pueblos from a little bit higher level, larger scale. So a lot of these differences that I just discussed, these are ways of organizing individual communities at a sort of a smaller scale. And so what we wanted to look at was differences in regional organization between these two areas and how that manifests itself over time. You can see on this map the Eastern Pueblos in yellow along the Rio Grande there, and the Western Pueblos in purple there in Arizona and Western New Mexico, and our Cohesion Bridge Pueblos of Laguna and Acoma in between. One of the issues with looking at regional organization is that while there's some very obvious differences, if just even looking at this map, there are significantly more Eastern Pueblos compared to Western Pueblos, so many that I can't include all the names of the Eastern Pueblos on this map, that this does not represent the entire history of these two regions. If we go back in time to around 1300, this map would look a little more something like this. In this case, the Eastern Pueblo region is a little bit larger, a little more expansive than it is in the present, but the Western Pueblo region is significantly more expansive in a geographic sense. There are more communities in what we would call a Western Pueblo area, and it covers a much larger area. So one of the things we want to be looking at as we're discussing the organization of these communities and their relationships to each other is how this organization changes from this earlier period to what we see in the present. So what are some of the goals for the project that we had for the project? The first thing is just, can we see differences in organization at a regional level and how different communities are related to each other? And this was not something we were concerned about. A lot of other archaeologists have discussed this topic and identified some of these differences. So we were pretty sure we could identify those same sorts of differences using the database we had available. What was more interesting to us is if we could figure out when we start seeing these distinctions. And this has been an issue ever since the topic of Western, or the concept of Western and Eastern Pueblos has come up, is how old is this distinction? When did this distinction originate? And that's something that people have debated for the last century. Some people think this goes back 1,000 or more years, and some people think that this distinction is actually fairly recent. So one of the contributions we wanted to maybe add to the discussion was if we could give some more evidence towards a particular timing of the distinction. One of the consequences of that is that we picked a date range, or a range for our project to cover that involves some of the periods in Puebloan history that we thought were good candidates for the point in time when this distinction arose. So there's 3 of these periods. The first one is around AD 1600, when New Mexico became a colony of Spain. So in 1598, New Mexico became a colony of Spain, and this created a lot of changes in Puebloan society. Pueblo labor was appropriated by colonists, both at missions and by encomenderos. Religious persecution was a major factor for this entire period. Spanish colonizers were trying to stamp out Puebloan religious practices, and the way that communities related to each other on the landscape also changed pretty significantly. Mission settlements were created in this period, and different communities were Puebloan communities were brought into these mission settlements. So this is a fairly obvious period to look for change in distinction between the two regions, especially considering that many of the Pueblos in the Western Pueblo region were not as directly impacted by Spanish colonialism as the Pueblos in the Eastern area. However, we do know from historical documents and archaeology that a lot of these distinctions that we credit to Eastern and Western Pueblo areas were already present when the Spanish colonized New Mexico. So really this time period, maybe it exacerbated these differences, but we can't say that this was the origination of those differences. The other time period one of the other time periods we want to look at is around AD 1450, basically the 15th century. What is really compelling about this point in time is that there's a lot of demographic changes in the Southwest as a whole, and these led to a lot of social changes in other ways. So the big thing that's happening for about a century here is a drastic decrease in populations across the Southwest. And that includes in Southern Arizona and the Hohokam area and in most of the Pueblo area. There's also pretty significant aggregation of communities in this time period. And aggregation is where multiple smaller communities are coming together as a single larger nucleated community. And that's a process that began earlier than this period, but it accelerates in some ways during this period, partly thanks to the significant population decline. The last period we wanted to look at is a potential time period when these differences between East and West manifested is around AD 1275, 1300, basically the late 13th century into the 14th century. And this is another significant period in Pueblo history. The major change here is that there's a shift of the population center of the Pueblo world from the Four Corners area into what would then become the Western and Eastern Pueblo regions. So there's a lot of out migrations from northern New Mexico and Arizona and southern Utah and Colorado into the Rio Grande and into central Arizona and parts of northern Arizona that would end up becoming the Eastern and Western Pueblo regions. So on that basis alone, it seems like a good place to be looking for these distinctions and changes in organization at a regional level, because people are moving so much and they are essentially moving into the areas that would become the geographic core of these two social distinctions. Another important factor at this time period is the creation of the beginning of really intense aggregation that continues in that 1450 period. And part of that includes the development of more pluralistic and complex communities where you have multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, multi-religious communities. And that entailed a lot of significant changes to social organization to accommodate for these much more diverse communities. So given that, we decided to take a look at the period between AD 1200 to 1700. That time period would encapsulate these three major turning points or major phases of Pueblo history, and also give us a little bit of a buffer on either side so we could see if there's some change from before or into the period after these major periods. But then the question is, how are we going to identify changes to organization, to regional organization? And the answer is that we wanted to apply a method called network analysis, formal network analysis, in order to look at organization. And particularly, we wanted to look at changes to network cohesion. And I'll explain more about that in a second. So network analysis is a methodology that is focused on describing relationships between actors. And those actors can be individuals, they can be families, they can be institutions, they could be archaeological sites. The core of network analysis is describing the relationships between these actors. For example, this is a visual representation of a network of noble families, elite families in 15th century Florence, and their relationships to each other, their marriages with each other, their business relationships with each other. And so this is a way of looking at the structure of that society in a sort of formal, quantified way. And this particular project was looking at how the Medici family came to power and became so influential in Florence through their position relative to these other lineages. We can apply this to archaeology, and many projects have applied network analyses to archaeology. This is an example for the time period we're looking at in part of the same area. We have two networks here, one for the 1300 to 1350 period, and one for the 1350 to 1400 period for Arizona and New Mexico west of the Continental Divide. All the blue and white lines you can see on the map are the connections between archaeological sites, the relationships between archaeological sites. And this has been a really successful method for looking at interaction at this large regional level, and looking at that kind of social organization at a large scale. The way this network has been constructed, which is how we constructed our networks for this project, was creating ties and relationships between sites based on the similarity of the ceramics at those sites. So two sites that had very similar ceramics, the styles, the types, the wares of ceramics, they would have a very strong relationship, whereas sites with very different ceramics would have a very weak relationship. We did this in this project, and it's been done in previous projects, because we believe that this similarity of ceramic consumption is a good proxy for general social interaction. So if two sites are exchanging ceramics with each other, that'll create more similar ceramic assemblages. If they're exchanging ceramics with the same third parties, that'll create similar ceramic assemblages. And in that way, it is a good proxy for sort of direct interaction between these sites. It also is a good proxy for other kinds of interaction, because if two sites are producing similar kinds of ceramics, then that speaks to the social connections they have that would allow the potters at two sites to produce similar styles and designs of pottery, and that they're using pottery perhaps in similar ways for similar purposes. And so that speaks to maybe other kinds of relationships they have, like marriage relationships. This method has been fairly successful in past projects. We've sort of demonstrated the utility of the method. In fact, you can see in this map that there are some groupings of sites on the map that correspond to what would end up becoming Hopi and Zuni. So even at this period, early period around 1300, we can see that the methodology works to a degree. It's identifying real patterns of relationships on the landscape. This is the method we applied to our larger database that includes New Mexico, and that allowed us to compare the two regions and address the issue of the distinction between this Western Pueblo region that was analyzed in a prior analysis and the Eastern Pueblo region. And the way we wanted to compare organization is through cohesion metrics and network cohesion. And all that means, network cohesion, just is any method of measuring how well connected a network is. So there's different ways you can measure that, but they're all getting at the same idea that a more cohesive network is one where the actors are more connected to each other than in a less cohesive network. For instance, we calculated the measured density for these networks for 50-year intervals from 1200 to 1700. And all density is it's a measurement of how many relationships there are in the network compared to how many there could be. So a density of 100% would indicate that that every site, every actor in the network is connected to every other one in the network. And a lower density means that there's fewer connections, there's fewer relationships. Different way of tackling cohesion, but getting at a similar idea, is distance. And distance is basically measuring how many intermediaries there are between any two actors in the network. It's basically your Kevin Bacon number. You know, how many people are between you and Kevin Bacon, right? How many people do you have to contact before you meet someone who knows Kevin Bacon? And the same idea here, if you have actors A and B in a network, if they are directly connected to each other, if they have a relationship to each other, then they have a distance of 1. If they have to go through a secondary party to connect to each other, then they're going to have a larger distance. So a larger distance means less cohesion. A shorter distance means greater cohesion because people have direct access or close to direct access to other actors in the network. So we calculated a bunch of these different cohesion metrics for this network of the greater Southwest in this time period across these 50-year intervals. And we came up with some maybe unsurprising results, but that are good because they indicate that the method is working. So the big one is that around 1450, we see a really large increase in cohesion for every single metric. This is the most significant change in these cohesion measures for this entire time period we're looking at. But we do also see two other periods where there is a little bit of change to cohesion. There's a slight drop in cohesion of the network, and that is at 1600, so in the colonial period, and then at 1300, so after this period of reorganization. And so this really validates the method to a degree where we know that these periods should be significant and that there should be reorganization or changes to organization in these periods, and that's what we see here. However, the picture is a little more complex than just this, and this doesn't really help us address the core question of, can we see these differences between Eastern and Western Pueblos? So to do that, we applied a clustering method to our networks. And clustering is basically just identifying groups of actors in a network, in this case sites, groups of sites, that are more connected to each other than they are to any of the other actors in the network. And you can see a visual representation of that here. These 6 different clusters, they have a greater density of ties and a greater strength of ties within each cluster than they do between the different clusters. And this is just a way to look at essentially different social groupings and who is interacting with each other more. What this lets us do, though, is we can calculate the same cohesion metrics for both the clusters as an entity and for between the clusters. So the interaction between the clusters, we can see how cohesive they are. By definition, because a cluster is more cohesive than, internally than it is with any of the other clusters, the cohesion metrics are going to be a lot stronger for the within the internal density or the internal cohesion compared to the without. But that doesn't mean that this measurement is useless. We can compare the relative strength of these things and the change in the two measurements over time. So as you can see here, we replicate sort of our previous analysis. We see a large increase in cohesion at 1450. But what is interesting is because these clusters are already so dense, they're already so cohesive and connected, that there's only a very slight increase in cohesion at 1450. In comparison, the density between these clusters, the connectivity between these clusters among them, really increases by 4 or 5-fold, from a fairly low level to a sort of moderate level. And so what this is telling us is that the increased connectivity in this period around 1450 is driven by connections between clusters of sites, that clusters of sites aren't getting more connected within themselves, but they are connecting better with other communities, with other Pueblo communities, and with other communities in the rest of the Southwest. But again, we aren't really getting at the distinction between Eastern and Western Pueblos. So we have to take this a step further. And we can break up the network even further and look at which clusters are made up of communities in the Eastern Pueblo and Western Pueblo regions. And that's what you're looking at here. This is a graph of the external density, so the density between clusters for Eastern Pueblos and for 2 different groupings of Western Pueblos. And what we see is, once again, a very large increase in connectivity between clusters of communities for the Eastern Pueblo regions. The clusters that are making up the Eastern Pueblo area are becoming increasingly connected to each other and to other clusters. However, we see a very different pattern for the Zuni area, where you actually get a decrease in cohesion. We don't have enough data on sites in the Hopi area after 1450 to be able to successfully extrapolate this pattern past that point. But we can make some assumptions about how similar the network measures are beforehand to how they might be afterwards. We haven't actually calculated that, but Hopi might look a lot like Zuni in this respect. So, all right, here we're finally getting at this issue of how differently is the Eastern Pueblo area organized compared to the Western Pueblo area. And what it looks like is that before 1450, both areas are organized very similarly, or at least they are similarly connected or well connected. They have similar cohesion scores, and this is true for other measures of cohesion as well, not just density like we have presented here. But then at 1450, there's a very rapid change to organization, and that change goes in different directions for each area. In the Eastern Pueblo area, we're leaning towards greater connectivity versus greater isolation or self-sufficiency in the Western Pueblo area. So this is great. This is getting us at that question we wanted to address. But what does this actually mean for organization? Like what would this look like on the ground? What is this actually telling us? What we think is going on is that we can explain some of these differences, these changes in organization through the development of some sort of market system or system of markets in the Eastern Pueblo area compared to the Western Pueblo area. So what we would expect in a system where you have large central markets is that everyone in that region who's coming to that market has greater access to the same goods, the same ceramics, for instance, if you have a market for pottery. What that would result in the networks is that everyone has more similar assemblages, more similar pottery assemblages. And so that will result in greater connectivity. What markets are doing is they're equalizing access to these diverse resources by bringing them all to a central place. Without the market, you have to go to the producers individually, and that limits the diversity of ceramics you have access to and how well everyone else in your network has access to those ceramics. So a market system would produce a similar pattern that we're seeing for the Eastern area. For the Western area, what would make sense for the pattern we're seeing is a little bit of the inverse, is that a more investment in local production and more investment in short distance local ties. And that makes sense given the context of the 1400s and having a decrease in population across the board. In the Western area, that's dealt with by really investing in these local ties. And in the Eastern area, that decrease in population and the concurrent decrease in the number of sites allows for these central places, these marketplaces, to become more important. It makes them more important for distributing goods. This isn't something that's particularly shocking for Southwest archaeologists. Archaeologists have noted these differences between the Eastern and Western Pueblo areas for a long while, that the Eastern area is a lot more integrated and there's a lot more movement of goods compared to the Western area where local connections and local production is a lot more important. However, what is exciting about this is the timing of it and the nature of the change to this system. What we have identified in the networks is that this was not a gradual change over a long period of time, but rather a really sudden change, essentially over a century between 1400 and 1500. And it also helps pinpoint the moment of that change to that period in the 15th century. So this is an exciting sort of development for that. If our networks or ceramic similarity networks are actually a good proxy for interaction, and that this is a good measure of interaction at a regional scale, then this really contributes by refining the timing of the divergence and also how that happened. We also think that this distinction that we've identified between a more integrated Eastern network and a more local, intensified Western network is supported by a lot of other archaeological data. For instance, in the Eastern Pueblo area, it's well documented that around the 15th century, there's a pretty large increase in plaza size at a lot of these communities. And what that means is that these communities have plazas that are much larger than they need just to service the population at that community. So people from other communities are coming to those pueblos, to those communities, to interact in these plazas. And that might be in rituals, dances, other religious activities, but it might also be for marketplaces. We also would suspect if there is a system of markets in the Eastern Pueblo area, that would encourage specialization of communities, that communities would be rewarded for specializing in producing certain goods. Because if there is this central or several central places that are distributing goods throughout the network, it's much easier to get your basic necessities through exchange. And you can specialize in producing one type of good, and exchange that for whatever you need without having to go to every single producer of those goods. You can get it all at a central marketplace. And we do have archaeological evidence for that. In a couple different goods, there is evidence for specialization, like cotton production in the Rio Grande, and ceramic production specifically, which is very relevant to the networks we've constructed. There's evidence for specialized ceramic production, particularly in the Galisteo Basin, south of Santa Fe. There are several communities that really intensified how much they were producing ceramics and how much they were exchanging this to other communities. This didn't totally supplant local ceramic production in the Rio Grande, but it is consistent with what we would expect for a system of marketplaces. This also is a very interesting sort of angle. It doesn't really reinvent the wheel here. Everything's very consistent with what our other archaeologists have discussed in terms of economic organization for Eastern and Western Pueblo areas. But the specific timing of this distinction between the two areas around 1450 in the 15th century is relevant, especially since we identify it as being a very sudden change. This is not a gradual change from 1300 onwards. It's a pretty big shift in a short period of time. And so what that suggests is that these other two major points of transformation that we identified at the start of this project, around 1300 and 1600, may not be quite as important as you would suspect, at least as far as regional organization goes. Even though there were a lot of changes around 1300, it doesn't seem like those had a really big impact on the economic regional organization of these communities until you get to the 15th century and you get these other changes, these demographic changes that are really pushing this change to organization. It also suggests that maybe Spanish colonialism, although it definitely had pretty major impacts on individuals and on specific communities, may not have really shaken up the organization of these communities at a big scale. So even though there was a lot of religious persecution, which was impacting individuals and communities, and even though there was a lot of exploitation of Pueblo labor, which again impacting specific communities and individuals, that didn't fundamentally shake the way that these communities were interacting with each other and exchanging goods with each other. So the sort of end result of this is not really a shift in how we understand the question of Eastern versus Western Pueblos, but it does sort of hint at maybe some ways we could take further research that looking at exactly how sudden the shift was, what maybe some of the catalysts are for that really sudden shift. We think, demographic change is an obvious one because the shift occurs in this period of major demographic change, but we haven't actually demonstrated that as is the case. It also would be really relevant to discuss how much this change in regional organization mirrors changes in smaller scale organization. So I began the talk discussing these distinctions between Eastern and Western Pueblos that early ethnographers identified. And most of those distinctions are actually at a sort of a smaller scale. It's how individual communities are organized. But our analysis doesn't actually touch on that. So a really interesting question would be, is the distinction or the divergence between Eastern and Western Pueblo organization that we identify at this large scale, is that consistent with the timing of the divergence between these smaller scale social elements? And that's something that would be perhaps very difficult to analyze in or come up with a way to test, but could be a really fruitful area of further research. And thank you everyone for paying attention. And I think we have some time for a question now.
Thank you so much, Evan. It's really a nice demonstration of what Cyber Southwest can do for us, right? It's very good. So I do have a couple of questions already. So let's just get started. What role does the fact of being river people, the Rio Grande, play in the Eastern Pueblo connectivity?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's definitely an ecological answer here that I'm not well equipped to answer. A lot of people have really looked into the ecology of farming people in different environments, so a riverine environment versus Zuni and Hopi, which are not that. But one of the things that would contribute potentially is just basic geography. The Rio Grande Pueblos are all strung out along this river valley, which makes actual travel and moving across these distances significantly easier than it would be going from Zuni to Hopi, for instance. So just on that basic level, it's makes it a lot easier for people to connect and to travel through the area. Whereas in Eastern or Western Arizona or Eastern Arizona, you've got a lot more mountains and a lot more elevation to deal with. That's maybe more of an inhibition to going to central places like marketplaces.
So there's a kind of related, why the Rio Grande area versus the Colorado River area?
Could be asked for elaboration on that potentially. I
could. If you'd like to elaborate on that, the person who asked that question, you're welcome to put it. Oh, maybe you have it here. Nope. I'll give you another one from her. Have more trade routes been identified with the Eastern Pueblos after 1400?
Well, trade routes are a tricky thing to find archaeologically, because really we're only ever seeing the two endpoints of trade, if that, which not always the case. But we do have a pretty good idea that there is a lot more exchange happening in the Eastern area. For instance, ceramics, we have a really good idea of how those are moving for the most part, and they're moving pretty significant distances. And that's true of ceramics in the Western area, sort of around 1300. For instance, White Mountain redware goes everywhere. It travels very long distances. But as we move further away from 1300 there, that drops off and ceramic exchange becomes a lot more localized. In the Eastern area, there's also a lot of evidence for exchange with different plains groups. So there's exchange between Pueblo groups and these plains groups for things like bison hides. And that happens at Hopi and Zuni also, but potentially not in as significant a way. There are certain Pueblos in the Eastern area, Pecos specifically, and some of the Humanos Pueblos in the southern Rio Grande area, who may have actually specialized as trade centers with these plains groups. So it seems like there is a lot more specialization in this kind of longer distance trade.
Okay, Why did the Western Pueblos not go in the direction of connectivity and integration like their Eastern counterparts? Might it have something to do with being less controlled by and disrupted by colonizers?
Yeah, I mean, there is a distinction there between how much the Spanish were able to control the Western and Eastern Pueblos. So the heart of colonial New Mexico was, the territory of New Mexico was in the Rio Grande. And Zuni and Hopi just geographically were much more outside the control of or the influence of Spanish colonizers. So that could be an influence, but what we were a little bit surprised to see in the network analysis is the networks don't change a ton after 1600. There is a little bit of a decrease in cohesion. So that definitely could be because of Spanish influence, Spanish control and the issues that Spanish colonialism introduced. And we actually don't see that with the Zuni area. There's actually a little bit of an increase in cohesion, which might be related to tapping into this wider colonial network of trade. But really the big change predates colonization.
Could you elaborate on and give specific examples of archaeological evidence for marketplace and market economies among pre-contact Pueblos?
Yes, so as I discussed a little bit, there's also there's this plaza evidence. There's a lot of elaboration of plazas around 1400. They become a lot larger and maybe more specialized towards use by multiple communities. So that's one angle of evidence. The other is really just the distribution of goods that we see. So for instance, some of the ceramics I've discussed in the Eastern area, they really travel pretty widely from these specific producers, individual communities that are producing them, which could definitely happen without a marketplace, but would definitely be aided, that wide distribution will be aided through markets and centralized places in which to acquire those goods. So we don't necessarily have a lot of direct evidence for markets, but the evidence we have is very consistent with a system of marketplaces.
What impact do these changes on warfare, if any? What impact do these changes have on warfare, if any, during these periods?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that archaeologists have discussed for a long time, and this is not something we really tapped into in this project, but it is related, is that this system of greater integration along the Rio Grande is one way to deal with such a diversity of people and communities in that landscape. So if you're trading consistently with all these different groups of people, that is a positive experience and a relationship you're building with those groups. And so that's really going to reduce the competition between groups. And that's going to be very necessary in this period where you do have all these groups that are coming together that are very diverse and maybe living next door to each other. What's interesting is that diversity and that landscape that's kind of ready for conflict exists much prior to this change we see. Around 1300, when we have all these migrations and you get all this aggregation of communities, that's also really setting the stage for potentially competition between communities. But the system we see is not developed until 100 years after that, 150 years after that. So the question is this replacing an earlier system that's mediating interaction, or is it in response to people are figuring out how to interact finally in this landscape?
All right. Do the institutional arrangements of religious and ritual societies among the Eastern Pueblos emerge around 14 to 1450? Can you tell that archaeologically?
Some people have tried. It's not easy to do. It's a pretty contentious debate is, how much antiquity is there with these religious societies. But it does seem like the importance of these religious societies may be increased at least by around 1300, but potentially a little bit later. Some people have argued for that. And that would, again, make sense with this sort of landscape that's very complex, and there's a lot of social complexities. So having these religious societies that you have at every single pueblo, and the people in those societies would have relationships with each other, that would be another way to reduce conflict and foster cooperation in that landscape. And if that wasn't a need in the Western Pueblo area, then that maybe sort of speaks to the reduced importance of those societies, at least as a social function.
All right. Network analysis is useful in answering the where and when. Could it be used to shed some light on why? Also, has this analysis attempted to incorporate linguistic analysis as in the Cohesion Bridge?
Both very good questions. I'll start with the linguistic one because that's easier. We didn't incorporate language into this. And one of the reasons we didn't want to do that is an advantage of network analysis is we can ignore the attributes of the actors in the network. So for instance, geographic proximity isn't taken into account in this analysis. So just because two pueblos are nearby, we might expect greater interaction, although not always, but we're not taking that into account. This is purely based on the ceramic similarity. And so we can kind of move away from ideas of this is a Cohesion area, this is a Tiwa area, this is a Tewa area, those kinds of analyses, which are very useful because those are real social distinctions. But this is a way to look at it without that kind of a priori baggage, if you will. It would be really interesting to then go back and add in the language element to this analysis, but reconstructing, which specific archaeological sites belong to what language group is very difficult. And so that's a whole nother project. As to the other question, what was the first part of that?
It was, it's useful in answering where and when. Could it be used to shed some light on why?
Yeah, so that is an issue. How can we interpret these statistics in a more like causal way, right? One of the things that could be useful that we could do is tie some of these network measures to other factors that we know are changing in this time period and which might influence this, and see how well they correlate with that. So for instance, because we see that the 15th century is really important, we might want to tie the network analysis to some measure of population, right? Relative population size in some way, or population density, something like that, to see if we're getting a really good correlation between these two factors. And obviously we can't speak directly to causation that way, but it gives at least a head start on figuring out the causation. Like, this is maybe a good place to look, or maybe we shouldn't be looking there.
Great. Any speculation about why the biggest shift occurred in the 1500s?
Yeah, again, with it's kind of the demographic angle is what we're really taking, but we haven't actually demonstrated that. What we're thinking in terms of why then and not earlier, given that a lot of the stuff that's happening in the 15th century, population decline, aggregation, all started much earlier, is that in the 15th century, you're reaching a little bit of a critical mass. So for marketplaces to function really well, you need enough central places to host those markets, essentially. And so as you've got about 200 years of aggregation, all these diverse communities coming together to make much fewer but larger communities, that's creating those central places that can act as a host for these marketplaces. And so it might be as simple as in the 15th century, you've reached a tipping point where you have enough of these central places and they're large enough that they can serve as market locations.
Okay, have the Salinas Pueblos been included in Cyber Southwest? And if not, why not? And thanks for a very clear presentation to a complex subject.
Thank you. And yes, they have been included in Cyber Southwest. Basically, there's a couple tiers of data in Cyber Southwest. The most basic tier is we have a record for sites that we know exist. And that's pretty comprehensive in terms of what's out there. But if we have additional data on the sites, that's a little more limited in scope. So we have, I don't know what the exact number is at the moment, but it's near 30,000 sites. And those are just a record that says this site exists. So that's kind of the high level there. But then the amount of sites that actually have ceramic data or artifact data or data about architecture is smaller than that. And I don't know the exact numbers here. I know at least some of the Salinas sites do have that level of detail, and I know that it does exist. So it will eventually be in Cyber Southwest if it is not currently. The plan is, if the data is out there and it exists, we're going to ingest it eventually, as long as the people who manage that data are okay with that. So
great. Have you compared these results with similar networks of market systems in Mesoamerica or other parts of the world? Is this similar to other situations in other places?
That's a great question, because we do have some, especially particularly from Central America, from Central Mexico specifically, there's a lot of good ethnographic evidence about market systems, and also archaeological evidence. So that would be a really good point of comparison. We didn't do that in this analysis because the focus was more on identifying the difference between East and West and the timing. But definitely the next step is to elaborate more on what exactly that looks like. What the market system looks like. Is this consistent with markets in systems of marketplaces in other areas? And that would definitely be the next step. And I think Central Mexico would be the most appropriate example to start with.
Related, could these markets and the social cohesion have contributed to the coordination needed for the Pueblo Revolt?
Yeah, fantastic question. That's one of the things that I think is really intriguing about what we identify as this system kind of persisting throughout the early colonial period, is that because it was still in place and more or less intact despite Spanish colonialism, this may have really contributed to that cooperation necessary for the Pueblo Revolt. So as a little bit of background, in 1680, basically a coalition of different pueblos in New Mexico rebelled against Spanish colonialism and kicked the colonizers out of New Mexico. And that really required a lot of cooperation between individual communities that did not have a central governance, right? And so this could definitely, this economic system could definitely have been part of what allowed for that cooperation. The religious societies that I talked about a little bit also were definitely a part of this. The leaders of these religious societies were communicating with each other in the Pueblo Revolt. We know that. And that was a key factor. So that there was maybe this continued economic system as well might dovetail with that, since a lot of the products being exchanged are richly important and important to those religious societies.
Right, we still have a few more. Were there many more pueblos in the Western group before 1450? If so, why don't we see connectivity between them?
Yes, so there are a lot more sites in the Western area, very significantly more before 1450. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but it's above 100, right? There's at least more than 100 sites. I think we're at some points in time there, we're talking above 200 sites in that Western area. And so what we see prior to 1450 is a situation that's very similar, both in the West and the East. You have a lot of sites, most of them smaller than the sites you get later on. And they're all clustering together more or less pretty intensely, and they have fairly weak connections outside of these clusters. And that's the case both the Eastern area and the Western area. And so it's after 1450 that you get this really significant change. And part of that change is probably just purely down to numbers, in that the number of sites in the Western area decreases much more significantly than the Eastern area. Although I should say that the Eastern area does experience a very significant decrease in the number of sites. You go again from over 100 sites to about 40 or 50. So at least cut in half, although not quite as severe as in the Western area. And then the last thing to consider also is in the Western area, what we see in the present of basically Zuni and Hopi, just those two locales, is not quite the case in the colonial period or even 1450 and onwards. You actually have a network of about a dozen sites in each area that are all connected to each other. So it's not just the one location, but it is a little bit larger of a network in the Western area up until you get to the present.
Have you looked at the effect of climate pre and post 1400? Does climate change affect cohesion between communities?
Wonderful question. I am not I don't do ecology essentially. So that's not really something we were interested in incorporating into this, although it would definitely be relevant, because if we're thinking that population is a major factor in this change, one of the things that ties to population pretty significantly are ecological changes. And a lot of other people have looked at this time period from an ecological lens, but we haven't explicitly tied that to what we're looking at, although you certainly could.
How about if network analysis ignores the attributes of actors, how does it help to reconcile various prehistorical descriptions of the same cultural phenomenon within a transdisciplinary paradigm?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, you're asking how essentially we can say anything about these ethnographic observations and these more anthropological observations using network analysis. And the answer is, in a sort of very direct sense, we can't. But the advantage of a network analysis is that the focus is on relationships as opposed to specific attributes. So what we're looking at in the network analysis is that two communities are have interactions with each other, as opposed to this is a Carrie-speaking community and this is a Tiwa-speaking community. So we're privileging the interaction as opposed to the sort of social identity. And those things are, of course, related. Your interactions set up the kinds of identification, your social identities, and vice versa. Your identities then prime you to have certain interactions. But we're really trying to take a little bit of a different approach to this by privileging those relationships. And that works better at this large scale, because we can't really get at that detail of like social identification for particular sites. It's really hard to ascribe, say, linguistic identity to a single site. And sometimes it might not make sense, because there might be multiple linguistic communities in a single site, multiple other social units in a site. So I think at this large scale, network analysis can kind of fit into the other, disciplinary context, because they're not necessarily doing able to look at those same things either. And I would say that at a smaller scale, you really need to bring in more of those, that interdisciplinary work, the ethnography, the anthropology, because at that small scale, it's too complex, and ignoring those attributes, those social attributes, is really going to cost you and make it difficult for you to actually understand what's going on.
All right, just a couple more. Has anyone thought to explore the increased connectivity in this time period with contemporary people of the Rio Grande Pueblos? I wonder if there are any oral histories addressing these relationship changes.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it would be a really good project. I think what little I know of the subject, there is a little bit of information about how people interacted with each other, but not necessarily as much information about how those relationships changed. That's a little more difficult to get at. So, for example, there's some oral history relating to sort of the early Spanish period and the immediate pre-Spanish period about interactions between Piaro-speaking groups in the southern Rio Grande and some of the southern Tiwa groups in the Albuquerque area, potential conflict there. But it doesn't really necessarily address the nature of how that relationship changed over time. And so that would be the difficult thing to tackle, but not as someone who is not working with oral histories or with the documentary record. I'm not equipped to answer if you could or couldn't do that, but it would be a bit of a difficulty.
All right. So someone wants to know if you have an article written about this, and if you do, we can put that in the follow-up email that goes out to everyone who participated. But the question is, do you have an article about this, and what's the title?
Yes, so there is an article. It is not published yet. We will be sending it out for review very shortly. So hopefully within the next 6 months or to a year, it will see publication. So unfortunately, I can't give that to you right now, but it'll be out there at some point.
Okay, thanks. And then the very last one is not a question, but a comment from Kelsey. She said, not a question, more of a comment. Great job. So thanks, Kelsey. Okay, thank you, Evan. That's what we have on the questions, and we really appreciate your taking the time. I understand after talking to you where you're at with your dissertation right now, and you took the time to do this for Arc and Hist. We really appreciate it. And I know you're heading off to field school soon as well. So thank you for taking the time, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And we'll see you again in June, I hope. Okay.
Thank you.
Good night.